Santiago García adjusted the knot of his Italian silk tie, his reflection staring back at him from the crystal mirror in the penthouse suite of the tallest building in Madrid. Outside the panoramic window, the city sprawled, a maze of lights and movement that mirrored his success. At 37, Santiago had achieved what many could only dream of. His name graced the covers of business magazines. His ventures were whispered about in exclusive circles, and he was days away from marrying Isabela López, heiress to the most prestigious hotel chain in Europe. On the marble-topped table before him lay a single golden envelope, a work of art in itself. The embossed script on its surface shimmered under the light, and Santiago's fingers lingered on it, feeling the weight of the decision it symbolized. Among the 300 meticulously curated invitations sent out for the grand event of the year, this one was unique. It bore the name of someone from a past Santiago thought he had left behind. María Ortega. His closest confidant, Javier, leaned against the doorway, his expression a mix of disbelief and concern. "You're really going through with this?" Javier asked, crossing his arms. "Inviting Maria to your wedding? It's been, 6 years since you last saw her." Santiago's lips curled into a faint smile, the kind that often preceded his boldest business moves. "Exactly," he replied. 6 years is a long time, long enough for her to see how far I've come. I want her to witness it, to realize what she lost when she clung to her small-town dreams instead of following me." Javier sighed, shaking his head. "This isn't about closure, is it? It's about showing off. Call it what you will," Santiago said, his tone unyielding. "But she needs to know I made the right decision when I left." The memory of their final encounter surfaced in Santiago's mind. It had been a gray, rainy day in March when Maria had begged him not to leave for London, her voice breaking as she tried to tell him something important. But Santiago, with his heart set on the opportunity of a lifetime, a position at an international investment firm, had been immovable. "You're the only person I trust to deliver this personally," Santiago said, holding out the envelope to Javier. "Make sure she gets it." Javier hesitated, his eyes searching Santiago's face for any sign of doubt. "Fine," he said finally, taking the envelope. "But don't say I didn't warn you." 2 weeks later, Santiago sat in the lounge of his penthouse, savoring a glass of rare Rioja wine. His phone buzzed with a message from Javier. Delivered. "She's coming." But she didn't seem happy about it. Santiago smirked, picturing Maria's reaction when she received the invitation. He imagined the conflicting emotions that must have played across her face. Confusion, curiosity, perhaps even regret. This was his moment, the culmination of years of hard work, sacrifice, and ambition. Every detail of the wedding had been designed to showcase his success. The ceremony was to take place in a centuries-old castle nestled in the Spanish countryside, rented exclusively for the occasion. The guest list was a who's who of European elites, and the reception menu had been crafted by a Michelin-starred chef. Even the floral arrangements had been imported from the Netherlands, their vibrant colors chosen to reflect opulence and sophistication. Isabella's voice broke through his thoughts. She entered the room gracefully, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor. "Darling, we need to finalize the reception menu. The chef is waiting," she said, wrapping her arms around him. "Of course," Santiago replied absently, though his mind was still preoccupied with thoughts of Maria. What would she wear? How would she react to the castle, the grandeur, the life he had built without her? That night, as Isabella slept beside him, Santiago found himself drawn to his laptop. On a whim, he searched for Maria on social media. Her profile was sparse, almost austere, with little more than her professional credentials, a degree in education and her current role as a teacher at a modest primary school. There were no photos of extravagant trips, no indications of a life that had changed dramatically since they parted ways. Santiago closed the laptop, his thoughts heavy. Maria's simplicity had once been a comfort, a grounding force against his own restless ambition. But now, that simplicity seemed like a relic from a life he had long since outgrown. In a small, sunlit apartment across town, Maria sat at her kitchen table, a cup of tea in her hands. The golden invitation rested nearby, catching the warm glow of the lamp. She had reread it countless times, her heart a tangle of emotions. What did Santiago want from her after all these years? Why had he chosen to invite her, of all people, to his wedding? She could still hear his voice in her memory, see the determination in his eyes when he had left her behind to chase his dreams. She glanced at the framed photo of her young son, Diego, on the counter. His green eyes, so full of curiosity, looked back at her, a constant reminder of the life she had built on her own. Santiago didn't know about Diego. He had left before she could tell him. For a moment, Maria considered tearing the invitation in two, discarding it along with the memories it had dredged up. But a stronger impulse held her back. She needed to see Santiago again, to close the door on the past and prove to herself that she had moved on. She whispered to herself, "Let him see the life I built, too. And let me see if he's really as perfect as he thinks he is." Maria placed the invitation in her bag and looked out the window at the twinkling city lights. Whatever happened at the wedding, she would face it with her head held high. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and golden, the Spanish countryside basking in a light that seemed almost divine. The ancient castle stood proudly against the horizon, its stone towers and sprawling gardens promising an event unlike any other. Santiago García stood at the window of his private suite, the luxurious fabric of his tailored Italian suit brushing against his skin. Below, the grand courtyard buzzed with activity. Guests arrived in sleek black cars, stepping out in glittering designer gowns and sharp tuxedos. Reporters and photographers lined the entrance, their cameras poised to capture the glamour and exclusivity of the occasion. Santiago's assistant, Alejandro, entered with his usual efficiency, holding a clipboard and looking slightly frazzled. "Señor Garcia, the press is asking for a statement before the ceremony," Alejandro said. "They're eager to know more about your partnership with the Lopez family." Santiago waved a dismissive hand. "Later. Right now, I'm focused on more important things." Alejandro hesitated, then nodded. "Understood, sir. Also, she has arrived." The words hit Santiago like a jolt of electricity. He turned sharply toward Alejandro, his face a careful mask. "She's here?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. Alejandro nodded. "Yes, senor. I saw her step out of the car a moment ago. Shall I ensure someone greets her?" Santiago shook his head. "No need. Let her come in and find her way. That's part of the experience." Alejandro raised an eyebrow but wisely kept his thoughts to himself. He exited the room, leaving Santiago alone with the weight of his expectations. Maria stepped out of the sleek black car, the cobblestones crunching under her modest heels. The castle loomed before her, an imposing structure that seemed both timeless and overwhelming. She adjusted the dark blue dress she had chosen, its simple elegance a stark contrast to the opulence around her. Beside her, Diego clung to her hand, his green eyes wide with wonder as he took in the scene. "Mama, is this a real castle?" he asked, his voice filled with awe. "Yes, Carino," Maria replied, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions within her. "It's a real castle." Diego's excitement was contagious, and for a moment, Maria allowed herself to smile. But as they approached the grand entrance, her heart began to pound. She felt the weight of the invitation in her bag, a symbol of the unresolved past she was walking into. Inside, the castle was a vision of perfection. Crystal chandeliers sparkled like stars, casting a warm glow over the marble floors. Guests mingled, their conversations a hum of anticipation, while servers glided between them with trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres. Maria's entrance did not go unnoticed. Heads turned, some with polite curiosity, others with poorly concealed surprise. She held her head high, her hand firmly on Diego's shoulder as she guided him through the crowd. From his vantage point at the top of the grand staircase, Santiago saw her before she saw him. Maria had not changed much in the years since they last met. Her dark hair cascaded down her back, and her posture was still as graceful and self-assured as he remembered. But it wasn't just Maria who caught his eye. It was the boy beside her, the boy with familiar green eyes and unruly dark curls. Santiago felt his breath hitch as his gaze locked on the child. Something primal and undeniable stirred within him, a feeling he couldn't yet name but knew he couldn't ignore. His pulse quickened, and for the first time that day, his confidence wavered. "Señor Garcia, are you ready for the ceremony?" A voice interrupted, pulling him back to the present. Alejandro had returned, his tone professional, yet slightly insistent. Santiago straightened, his composure snapping back into place. "I'll be down shortly," he said, his voice cool and controlled. But as Alejandro turned to leave, Santiago stopped him. "Alejandro, make sure Maria Ortega is comfortable." And he hesitated, the words catching in his throat. "Find out who the boy is." Alejandro nodded, though his expression betrayed a flicker of curiosity. Maria had just settled Diego at a quiet table near the edge of the grand hall when Santiago made his approach. He moved through the crowd with practiced ease, his smile charming, his demeanor exuding the confidence of a man who owned not just the castle, but the world around him. "Maria," he said as he reached her, his voice smooth but tinged with an undercurrent of something deeper. "I'm glad you could make it." Maria turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "Santiago," she replied, her tone polite but distant. "Thank you for the invitation. It's quite the spectacle." His eyes flicked briefly to Diego, who was too engrossed in a plate of pastries to notice their exchange. "I see you brought company," Santiago said, his voice carefully neutral. Maria's posture stiffened slightly, but she met his gaze with unwavering calm. "Yes, this is my son, Diego." For a moment, Santiago said nothing, his mind racing as he connected the dots. The green eyes, the dark curls, the subtle familiarity in the boy's features. It was undeniable. But before he could speak, Maria leaned in slightly, her voice low. "I'm sure you have questions, Santiago, but today isn't the day for answers." Her words struck him like a challenge, and for the first time, Santiago felt the weight of a truth he wasn't ready to confront. The orchestra began to play, signaling the start of the ceremony. Guests moved toward the main hall, their excitement palpable. Maria excused herself, guiding Diego toward the back of the room, away from the center of attention. As Santiago watched her go, a maelstrom of emotions churned within him. Curiosity, regret, and something he hadn't felt in years. Vulnerability. The ceremony awaited, but Santiago's thoughts were no longer on his fiancée, the guests, or the grandeur of the event. Instead, they were consumed by the woman and child who had just turned his perfectly orchestrated world upside down. The grand hall of the castle was a vision of opulence. Rows of gold-trimmed chairs lined the marble floor, facing an altar adorned with cascading flowers imported from the Netherlands. The air buzzed with anticipation as guests found their seats, their whispered conversations blending with the soft melody of the orchestra. At the front of the room, Isabela López stood resplendent in her designer wedding gown, her every movement exuding grace and confidence. She was the embodiment of sophistication, the perfect partner for Santiago García, or so it seemed to everyone gathered there. But Santiago's mind was elsewhere. As he stood by the altar, waiting for the ceremony to begin, he couldn't stop himself from glancing toward the back of the room, where Maria sat with Diego. The boy fidgeted in his seat, his curious eyes wandering across the ornate hall, while Maria sat poised and composed, her expression revealing nothing. "Are you nervous, mi amor?" Isabella's voice broke through his thoughts. She had stepped beside him, her warm smile meant to reassure. Santiago forced a smile in return. "Just the usual pre-ceremony nerves," he lied. Isabela laughed softly, mistaking his distraction for the jitters of a man about to commit to a lifelong partnership. "Don't worry. After today, Everything will fall into place. But Santiago wasn't so sure. In the back row, Maria watched the ceremony unfold, her thoughts a whirlwind of memories and emotions. She hadn't seen Santiago in years, and yet here she was, sitting in the middle of his grand wedding, a guest to a life she had once imagined sharing with him. Diego tugged at her sleeve, his voice a whisper. "Mama, why is everyone looking at that lady?" Maria leaned down, brushing a strand of hair from his face. "Because she's the bride, Carino. This is her special day." Diego frowned thoughtfully. "She's pretty, but I think you're prettier." A soft laugh escaped Maria despite herself. "Thank you, mi amor. You're very sweet." But her amusement faded as her gaze drifted back to Santiago. How had it come to this? 6 years ago, she had begged him to stay, to listen to what she had to say. But Santiago had been consumed by his ambitions, unwilling to let anything or anyone hold him back. Now, here he was, standing on the precipice of a future he had worked so hard to build. And yet, Maria couldn't shake the feeling that beneath the polished surface, Santiago was as conflicted as she was. As the officiant began to speak, Santiago found himself unable to focus on the words. His mind raced, caught between the present and the memories of his past with Maria. He remembered the way she had looked at him on that rainy March day, her eyes pleading as she tried to tell him something he hadn't wanted to hear. He had dismissed her then, convinced that his career was the only thing that mattered. Now, as he stole another glance at her, and the boys sitting beside her, Santiago felt the weight of his decisions pressing down on him. When the officiant turned to him and asked if he would take Isabela as his wife, the room fell silent, the pause stretching longer than anyone expected. "Santiago?" Isabela prompted, her tone light but tinged with confusion. Santiago hesitated, his voice faltering. His gaze flickered toward Maria and Diego once more, the unspoken questions burning in his chest. But before he could speak, the sound of Diego's voice cut through the silence. "Mama, I'm thirsty," the boy said, his words innocent but carrying through the hall. All eyes turned to Maria and Diego, the interruption shattering the ceremony's carefully curated atmosphere. Maria's cheeks flushed as she quickly rose, guiding Diego out of the hall. "Lo siento," she murmured, avoiding the curious stares of the guests. Santiago watched them go, his heart pounding. The interruption was brief, but its impact lingered. He could feel Isabela's gaze on him, her expression now clouded with suspicion. Outside, Maria knelt beside Diego as he sipped from a glass of water one of the staff had brought him. "Why are you nervous, Mama?" Diego asked, his innocent eyes studying her face. Maria hesitated, unsure how to answer. "I'm not nervous, Carino. Just thinking. About the man who invited us?" Her breath caught, but she nodded. "Yes, about him. Is he a friend?" Maria looked away, her emotions threatening to overwhelm her. "No, not anymore." Diego tilted his head, his curiosity unabated. "But you know him?" "Yes," Maria said softly. "A long time ago?" Back in the hall, the ceremony resumed, but Santiago's focus was irrevocably shattered. The image of Maria and Diego lingered in his mind, haunting him with questions he couldn't ignore. When the ceremony concluded, and the applause of the guests filled the air, Santiago's mind was made up. He would find Maria, confront her, and finally demand the answers he deserved. The reception hall was a masterpiece of elegance. Tables adorned with gold-rimmed crystal glasses and ivory linens stretched across the vast room, each centerpiece a cascade of orchids and roses imported specifically for the occasion. The soft glow of chandeliers cast a warm light over the scene as the guests mingled, their conversations blending with the soothing notes of the live orchestra. Maria stood at the edge of the room, her posture stiff as she held a glass of sparkling water. Diego had been escorted to a quieter space where a nanny watched over the children, giving Maria a brief moment to collect her thoughts. But despite the opulent surroundings, she felt out of place, a relic from a different world. She wasn't here to celebrate. She wasn't here to congratulate Santiago. She had come to close a chapter, to face the man who had left her behind, and to show him the life he had missed. Maria, the voice was unmistakable, smooth, confident, yet laced with an undercurrent of tension. She turned slowly, meeting Santiago's gaze. He stood before her, his tailored suit accentuating his tall frame, his expression carefully composed. But his eyes betrayed him. There was a storm brewing beneath his polished exterior. "Santiago," she greeted, her voice calm but distant. For a moment, neither spoke. The noise of the reception seemed to fade into the background as the weight of their shared history pressed down on them. "I need to talk to you," Santiago said finally, his tone firm. Maria raised an eyebrow, her fingers tightening around the stem of her glass. "You're the groom. Shouldn't you be celebrating with your bride?" A flicker of frustration crossed his face. "Isabela can wait. This is more important." Maria's lips curved into a faint, almost bitter smile. "More important? That's a change." Santiago's jaw tightened, but he didn't rise to the bait. Instead, he gestured toward a nearby balcony. "Can we talk in private?" The night air was cool and crisp as they stepped onto the balcony, the sounds of the reception muffled by the heavy glass doors. Below them, the castle gardens stretched out like a dream, their pathways illuminated by flickering lanterns. Santiago leaned against the railing, his hands gripping the cold stone as he struggled to find the right words. Maria stood a few steps away, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked finally, his voice quiet but edged with emotion. Maria frowned. "Tell you what, Santiago?" "You know what I mean," he said, turning to face her. "The boy, Diego, he's my son," Maria interrupted, her tone sharp. "What about him?" Santiago's eyes narrowed. "Don't play games with me, Maria. He's my son too, isn't he?" The question hung in the air, heavy with the weight of unspoken truths. Maria looked away, her heart pounding in her chest. She had known this moment would come, but she hadn't expected it to happen here, in the middle of Santiago's wedding. "Yes," she admitted finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's your son." Santiago exhaled sharply, his grip on the railing tightening. "Why didn't you tell me? Why did you keep him from me all these years?" Maria's head snapped back toward him, her eyes blazing. "I didn't keep him from you, Santiago. You left. You made it very clear that your career was more important than anything else. I tried to reach you, but you didn't want to hear from me. I didn't know." He shot back, his voice rising. "If I had known, I would have." "Would have what?" Maria cut him off, her tone dripping with bitterness. "Would you have stayed? Given up your big dreams for a small-town life with me and a baby? Don't lie to yourself, Santiago. You would have resented us." Her words hit him like a slap, the truth of them cutting deeper than he cared to admit. He had been so focused on his ambitions, so determined to succeed, that he had blinded himself to anything else. "I made mistakes," he said after a long pause, his voice quieter now. "But I deserve to be a part of his life." Maria's expression softened, but only slightly. "Diego doesn't even know who you are. He's grown up without a father, and he's fine. What makes you think you can just walk into his life now and change everything?" "Because I have to," Santiago said, his tone resolute. "I can't ignore this, Maria. I won't. He's my son, and I'll do whatever it takes to prove that I'm worthy of being in his life." Maria studied him for a long moment, her emotions warring within her. She had spent years building a life for herself and Diego, a life free of the pain Santiago had left behind. Letting him back in felt like reopening old wounds. But as she looked into his eyes, she saw something she hadn't expected. Genuine remorse and determination. "I don't know if I can trust you," she said finally, her voice trembling. Santiago stepped closer, his gaze unwavering. "Then let me earn your trust. Let me prove to you and to Diego that I'm not the man I used to be. Inside the castle, the reception carried on, the guests oblivious to the charged conversation happening on the balcony. But for Santiago and Maria, the night had taken a turn neither of them could have anticipated. As they stood there, the tension between them unspoken but palpable, both knew that their lives were about to change in ways they couldn't yet predict. The night deepened, and the golden glow from the chandeliers inside the castle spilled faintly onto the balcony, where Santiago and Maria stood. The tension between them was almost tangible, a silent battle of wills layered with years of unresolved emotions. Maria turned her gaze toward the sprawling gardens below, the soft rustling of leaves offering a momentary distraction. Santiago, however, couldn't take his eyes off her. The woman before him was not the same person he had left behind 6 years ago. She was stronger, sharper, and carried herself with a quiet confidence that both intrigued and unsettled him. "Does Diego know?" Santiago asked, breaking the silence. His voice was steady, but there was an unmistakable edge of vulnerability. Maria's hands tightened on the balcony railing. "He knows he has a father. I told him enough to satisfy his questions, but I never gave him your name." Santiago's brows knitted in frustration. "Why, he has a right to know." Maria's head snapped toward him, her eyes flashing. "And where were you when he needed that right, Santiago? Where were you when I was holding him at night, wondering if he'd ever have a father figure? You left, and I had to pick up the pieces. So don't stand there and lecture me about rights." Her words struck him hard, and for a moment, Santiago had no response. The weight of her accusations was impossible to deny. He had walked away, prioritizing his dreams over everything else. "I didn't know," he said finally, his voice low. "And if you had—" Maria challenged, stepping closer, her gaze piercing. "Would you have stayed? Would you have given up everything you've built for the sake of a child you didn't plan for?" Santiago hesitated, and in that moment of silence, Maria shook her head. "That's what I thought." Inside the castle, the reception was in full swing. Isabela moved gracefully through the crowd, her radiant smile masking the unease she felt. Santiago's absence had not gone unnoticed, and the whispers among the guests were growing louder. Alejandro approached her, his expression carefully neutral. "Señora López, is there anything you need? Perhaps we can have the orchestra play another set to keep the guests entertained." Isabela's smile faltered for a fraction of a second before she regained her composure. "That won't be necessary, Alejandro. Santiago will be back shortly. He's probably just tending to some business." Alejandro inclined his head, his face betraying no emotion. But as he walked away, Isabela's smile faded. Her instincts told her something was wrong, and she was determined to find out what. Back on the balcony, Santiago took a deep breath, forcing himself to confront the uncomfortable truths Maria had laid bare. "You're right," he admitted, his voice quiet but firm. "I was selfish. I left because I thought it was the only way to succeed. But I didn't know what I was giving up. If I had known about Diego—" Maria cut him off with a bitter laugh. "You think knowing would have changed anything? You were so focused on yourself that nothing else mattered. Not me, not us, and certainly not a baby." Her words stung, but Santiago didn't flinch. "You're right again," he said, meeting her gaze. "I wasn't ready then, but I am now." Maria crossed her arms, her skepticism clear. "And what does ready mean to you, Santiago? Ready to swoop in and play the hero? To write a few checks and call it fatherhood?" "No," Santiago said, his tone resolute. "It means being there for him. It means proving to both of you that I'm serious, that I want to be part of his life. And yours." Maria's breath caught at his words, but she quickly masked her reaction. "It's not that simple. Diego doesn't know you, and I'm not just going to let you waltz in and turn his life upside down because you suddenly decided you care. I'm not asking for an instant solution," Santiago said, his voice softening. "I'm asking for a chance. That's all." For the first time, Maria hesitated. The man standing before her was different from the Santiago she had known. There was a sincerity in his voice, a determination in his eyes that made her want to believe him. But the scars of the past were not so easily ignored. The door to the balcony opened abruptly, and both Santiago and Maria turned to see Isabela stepping into the cool night air. Her smile was gone, replaced by a mixture of confusion and suspicion. "Santiago," she said, her voice sharp. "What's going on?" Santiago straightened, his composure returning like a shield. "Isabela, I was just talking to your guest," she interrupted, her eyes flicking to Maria. "It's quite the private conversation for a reception, don't you think?" Maria felt the weight of Isabela's scrutiny, but refused to be intimidated. "If you'll excuse me," she said, stepping away. "I should check on my son." She brushed past Isabela without another word, leaving the two of them alone on the balcony. Isabela turned to Santiago, her expression demanding answers. "Who is she? And why does she matter so much that you leave your own reception to talk to her?" Santiago hesitated, the weight of the truth pressing down on him. He had built a life with Isabela based on ambition and appearances, but standing on this balcony, he realized how fragile that foundation truly was. "She's someone from my past," he said finally, "and someone I need to make things right with." Isabela's eyes narrowed. "What kind of past are we talking about?" Santiago sighed, running a hand through his hair. "The kind that changes everything." As Maria made her way back inside, her thoughts swirled in turmoil. Santiago's words echoed in her mind, challenging the walls she had built around her heart. She had come to this wedding expecting closure, but now she wasn't sure what she had found. Diego looked up as she approached, his face lighting up with a smile. "Mama, can I have another pastry?" Maria managed a small smile, brushing a hand over his hair. "Of course, Carino. Let's find you something to eat." As she led him toward the buffet, she couldn't help but glance over her shoulder, her eyes lingering on the balcony where Santiago and Isabela stood. The night was far from over, and Maria had a feeling the true confrontation was yet to come. The night deepened, and the golden glow from the chandeliers inside the castle spilled faintly onto the balcony, where Santiago and Maria stood. The tension between them was almost tangible, a silent battle of wills layered with years of unresolved emotions. Maria turned her gaze toward the sprawling gardens below, the soft rustling of leaves offering a momentary distraction. Santiago, however, couldn't take his eyes off her. The woman before him was not the same person he had left behind 6 years ago. She was stronger, sharper, and carried herself with a quiet confidence that both intrigued and unsettled him. "Does Diego know?" Santiago asked, breaking the silence. His voice was steady, but there was an unmistakable edge of vulnerability. Maria's hands tightened on the balcony railing. "He knows he has a father. I told him enough to satisfy his questions, but I never gave him your name." Santiago's brows knitted in frustration. "Why, he has a right to know." Maria's head snapped toward him, her eyes flashing. "And where were you when he needed that right, Santiago? Where were you when I was holding him at night, wondering if he'd ever have a father figure? You left, and I had to pick up the pieces. So don't stand there and lecture me about rights." Her words struck him hard, and for a moment, Santiago had no response. The weight of her accusations was impossible to deny. He had walked away, prioritizing his dreams over everything else. "I didn't know," he said finally, his voice low. "And if you had—" Maria challenged, stepping closer, her gaze piercing. "Would you have stayed? Would you have given up everything you've built for the sake of a child you didn't plan for?" Santiago hesitated, and in that moment of silence, Maria shook her head. "That's what I thought." Inside the castle, the reception was in full swing. Isabela moved gracefully through the crowd, her radiant smile masking the unease she felt. Santiago's absence had not gone unnoticed, and the whispers among the guests were growing louder. Alejandro approached her, his expression carefully neutral. "Senora Lopez, is there anything you need? Perhaps we can have the orchestra play another set to keep the guests entertained." Isabella's smile faltered for a fraction of a second before she regained her composure. "That won't be necessary, Alejandro. Santiago will be back shortly. He's probably just tending to some business." Alejandro inclined his head, his face betraying no emotion. But as he walked away, Isabella's smile faded. Her instincts told her something was wrong, and she was determined to find out what. Back on the balcony, Santiago took a deep breath, forcing himself to confront the uncomfortable truths Maria had laid bare. "You're right," he admitted, his voice quiet but firm. "I was selfish. I left because I thought it was the only way to succeed. But I didn't know what I was giving up. If I had known about Diego..." Maria cut him off with a bitter laugh. "You think knowing would have changed anything? You were so focused on yourself that nothing else mattered. Not me, not us, and certainly not a baby." Her words stung, but Santiago didn't flinch. "You're right again," he said, meeting her gaze. "I wasn't ready then, but I am now." Maria crossed her arms, her skepticism clear. "And what does ready mean to you, Santiago? Ready to swoop in and play the hero? To write a few checks and call it fatherhood?" "No," Santiago said, his tone resolute. "It means being there for him. It means proving to both of you that I'm serious, that I want to be part of his life. And yours." Maria's breath caught at his words, but she quickly masked her reaction. "It's not that simple. Diego doesn't know you, and I'm not just going to let you waltz in and turn his life upside down because you suddenly decided you care. I'm not asking for an instant solution," Santiago said, his voice softening. "I'm asking for a chance. That's all." For the first time, Maria hesitated. The man standing before her was different from the Santiago she had known. There was a sincerity in his voice, a determination in his eyes that made her want to believe him. But the scars of the past were not so easily ignored. The door to the balcony opened abruptly, and both Santiago and Maria turned to see Isabela stepping into the cool night air. Her smile was gone, replaced by a mixture of confusion and suspicion. "Santiago," she said, her voice sharp. "What's going on?" Santiago straightened, his composure returning like a shield. "Isabela, I was just..." "Talking to your guest," she interrupted, her eyes flicking to Maria. "It's quite the private conversation for a reception, don't you think?" Maria felt the weight of Isabela's scrutiny, but refused to be intimidated. "If you'll excuse me," she said, stepping away. "I should check on my son." She brushed past Isabela without another word, leaving the two of them alone on the balcony. Isabela turned to Santiago, her expression demanding answers. "Who is she? And why does she matter so much that you leave your own reception to talk to her?" Santiago hesitated, the weight of the truth pressing down on him. He had built a life with Isabela based on ambition and appearances, but standing on this balcony, he realized how fragile that foundation truly was. "She's someone from my past," he said finally, "and someone I need to make things right with." Isabela's eyes narrowed. "What kind of past are we talking about?" Santiago sighed, running a hand through his hair. "The kind that changes everything." As Maria made her way back inside, her thoughts swirled in turmoil. Santiago's words echoed in her mind, challenging the walls she had built around her heart. She had come to this wedding expecting closure, but now she wasn't sure what she had found. Diego looked up as she approached, his face lighting up with a smile. "Mama, can I have another pastry?" Maria managed a small smile, brushing a hand over his hair. "Of course, Carino. Let's find you something to eat." As she led him toward the buffet, she couldn't help but glance over her shoulder, her eyes lingering on the balcony where Santiago and Isabela stood. The night was far from over, and Maria had a feeling the true confrontation was yet to come. The glittering reception pressed on, a symphony of laughter, music, and the clinking of crystal glasses. Guests danced under the glowing chandeliers, their conversations blending into a harmonious hum. Yet for Isabela, the glamour of the evening felt like a veneer, thin, fragile, and threatening to crack. Standing at the edge of the hall, she watched Santiago weave through the crowd. His polished demeanor, so effortless in any other circumstance, now seemed forced. Isabela's sharp instincts told her something was wrong, and she had a sinking feeling that the woman from earlier was at the center of it. When she finally spotted Maria sitting with Diego at one of the quieter tables, her curiosity turned to resolve. She would get her answers. Maria sensed the approaching storm before she saw Isabela. The subtle shift in the atmosphere, the way nearby conversations grew hushed. It all signaled the arrival of someone accustomed to commanding attention. "Buenas noches," Isabela said smoothly as she stopped beside the table. Her smile was polite, but her eyes held an edge. "I don't believe we've been introduced." Maria straightened, her posture instinctively defensive. "María Ortega," she replied evenly. Isabela's gaze flicked briefly to Diego, who was preoccupied with a small toy car he had pulled from his pocket. Her smile tightened. "And this must be your son. He's adorable." "Thank you," Maria said, her tone cool. Isabela pulled out a chair and sat down uninvited, her movements deliberate and controlled. "I couldn't help but notice that you and Santiago were deep in conversation earlier. It's unusual for him to step away during an event like this. May I ask how you know each other?" Maria hesitated for a fraction of a second before replying. "We were close a long time ago." "I see," Isabela said, her expression unreadable. "And now you're here, with your son." Maria met her gaze, refusing to be intimidated. "Santiago invited us." Isabela tilted her head slightly, her smile never wavering. "Did he? How thoughtful of him." The tension between them was palpable, an unspoken battle of wills. Isabela's polished exterior was a stark contrast to Maria's quiet strength, but neither woman was willing to back down. Across the room, Santiago noticed the interaction and felt a surge of unease. He excused himself from a group of colleagues and made his way toward the table, his strides purposeful. "Isabela," he said as he approached, his voice calm but firm, "I see you've met Maria." Isabela looked up at him, her smile sharpening. "Yes, we were just getting acquainted. Maria was telling me about your shared history." Santiago's jaw tightened, but he maintained his composure. "Perhaps this isn't the best time for that conversation." "Oh, I disagree," Isabela said, rising gracefully to her feet. "It seems like the perfect time to understand why my fiancé is so invested in someone from his past." Maria stood as well, her gaze flickering between Santiago and Isabela. "I think it's time for Diego and me to leave," she said, her tone measured. "No," Santiago said quickly, stepping closer. "You don't have to go." Isabela's eyes narrowed. "Santiago, what is this about? Why is she here, and why are you so concerned about her leaving?" The moment of truth loomed, and Santiago knew he couldn't avoid it any longer. The weight of his secrets, the choices he had made, and the boys sitting at the table, they all converged in this one moment. "Isabela," he began, his voice steady but laced with emotion, "there's something you need to know." Maria's heart raced as Santiago spoke, her mind grappling with the implications of what he was about to reveal. She had hoped to keep Diego shielded from the complexities of the situation, but it seemed that hope was slipping away. Isabela crossed her arms, her polished facade cracking ever so slightly. "I'm listening." Santiago hesitated, his gaze darting briefly to Maria before returning to Isabela. "Maria and I have a history, yes, but this isn't just about the past. It's about the present." He took a deep breath. "Diego is my son." The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. For a moment, the world seemed to stand still. Isabela's expression shifted, disbelief flashing across her face before it hardened into something colder. "What did you just say?" "Diego is my son," Santiago repeated, his voice firmer this time. Isabella's laugh was sharp, almost incredulous. "And you're just now telling me this? On our wedding day?" "I didn't know," Santiago said quickly. "Not until tonight." Her gaze snapped to Maria, her tone accusatory. "Did you know about this? Did you come here to ruin our wedding?" Maria's eyes narrowed, her voice calm but edged with steel. "I came here because Santiago invited me. I didn't know he would figure it out tonight." Isabela turned back to Santiago, her voice rising. "And you? What exactly are you planning to do about this? Cancel the wedding and play happy families with her?" "I don't know," Santiago admitted, his honesty cutting through the tension. "But I do know I need to be in my son's life." Nearby guests began to notice the confrontation, their whispers adding a new layer of discomfort to the scene. Maria stepped forward, her voice quiet but commanding. "This isn't the time or place for this conversation. I didn't come here to disrupt your wedding, Isabela. Santiago and I will handle this privately." But Isabela wasn't ready to back down. "You've already disrupted everything," she snapped. "Do you even understand what this means? For him, for me, for all of us?" Maria met her gaze with unflinching calm. "I understand perfectly, but this isn't about you or me. It's about Diego." Santiago stepped between them, his voice steady but firm. "Enough. This isn't going to be solved tonight. Isabela, I'll talk to you later. Maria, I'll walk you and Diego out." Isabela stared at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of anger and hurt. "You will regret this, Santiago." "Maybe," he said softly, "but I can't ignore this." As Santiago escorted Maria and Diego out of the hall, the weight of the evening bore down on him. He had crossed a line, and there would be consequences. But for the first time in years, he felt like he was doing the right thing. The cool night air greeted Maria as she stepped out of the castle, her heels clicking softly against the cobblestones. Diego clutched her hand, his small fingers warm and trusting. He looked up at her with a curious expression, sensing the tension but not fully understanding its source. "Are we leaving, Mama?" he asked, his voice tinged with disappointment. "I wanted to see the garden lights again." Maria knelt to his level, brushing a stray curl from his forehead. "We'll see the lights another time, Carino. It's late, and we should get home." Behind her, Santiago followed silently, his presence heavy with unspoken words. He caught up to them near the valet stand, his gaze darting between Maria and Diego. "I'll take you home," he offered, his voice steady, but carrying an undercurrent of urgency. Maria straightened, her expression guarded. "That's not necessary. I've already called for a car." Santiago shook his head. "Please let me do this. I need to talk to both of you." She hesitated, her instincts telling her to refuse. But there was something in Santiago's eyes, a mix of determination and vulnerability, that made her pause. "All right," she said finally, her voice low. "But only because I don't want Diego falling asleep in a taxi." The drive was quiet at first, the hum of the car's engine filling the space between them. Maria sat in the back seat with Diego, her arm draped protectively around him as his eyelids grew heavy. Santiago glanced at them in the rearview mirror, his mind racing with thoughts of how to bridge the gap between him and the child who had changed everything. "Diego," Santiago said after a moment, his voice soft. The boy blinked sleepily, his green eyes meeting Santiago's in the mirror. "Yes." "Did you enjoy the castle?" Santiago asked, keeping his tone light. Diego nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. "It was really big, and the flowers were pretty." Santiago chuckled. "I'm glad you liked it. Maybe one day I can show you the gardens properly." Diego tilted his head, considering the idea. "Okay, but only if Mama comes too." Maria tightened her hold on Diego, her gaze fixed out the window. The innocence of his response made her heart ache. As they neared Maria's apartment, Santiago broke the silence again. "Maria, I meant what I said earlier. I want to be part of his life." She sighed, her voice weary. It's not that simple, Santiago. You can't just walk in and expect everything to fall into place. I know, he said, his tone resolute, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes. I want to get to know him, to be there for him. Maria turned to face him, her eyes filled with a mix of frustration and sorrow. Do you even know what that means? It's not about grand gestures or promises. It's about showing up every day, no matter how hard it gets. I'm prepared for that, Santiago insisted, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. Maria shook her head. We'll see. When they arrived, Santiago parked the car and stepped out, opening the door for Maria and Diego. The boy stirred in her arms, half asleep but still clinging to her neck. Thank you for the ride, Maria said, her tone polite but distant. Santiago hesitated, his gaze fixed on Diego's face. Can I carry him? Maria hesitated, but then she nodded, gently transferring the sleeping boy into Santiago's arms. It was the first time Santiago had held his son, and the weight of it hit him like a tidal wave. Diego's small body was warm and trusting, his head resting against Santiago's shoulder. It was a moment Santiago would never forget, a moment that filled him with both joy and an overwhelming sense of responsibility. Maria led the way up the stairs to her apartment, unlocking the door and stepping inside. Santiago followed, carefully laying Diego on the couch and covering him with a blanket. He looks like you, Santiago said softly, his voice filled with wonder. Maria crossed her arms, leaning against the wall. He has your eyes, but the rest of him is all me. Santiago smiled faintly, his gaze lingering on Diego. He's incredible, Maria. You've done an amazing job. Her expression softened for a moment, but then she straightened, her guard returning. Thank you, but this doesn't change anything. If you're serious about being part of his life, you'll need to prove it. To both of us. I will, Santiago promised. Whatever it takes. As Santiago prepared to leave, he paused at the door, turning back to look at Maria. Thank you for letting me spend this time with him. Maria nodded, her voice quiet. Good night, Santiago. He stepped out into the night, the door closing softly behind him. For the first time in years, Santiago felt a glimmer of something he couldn't quite name. Hope. The morning after the wedding, Santiago sat in his penthouse, staring out at the Madrid skyline. The city buzzed with life, but for once, Santiago felt utterly still. A cup of untouched coffee sat on the table beside him, the aroma mingling with the faint scent of cologne on his shirt. He hadn't slept. His thoughts had been consumed by the previous night, by Diego, by Maria, and by the fractured relationship with Isabela that now hung by a thread. The soft chime of his phone snapped him out of his reverie. It was a message from Isabela. We need to talk. Santiago sighed, running a hand through his hair. He had been expecting this. Last night's revelations had left little room for reconciliation, but he owed her an explanation. At the Lopez family estate, Isabela waited in the sprawling living room, her polished appearance concealing the storm of emotions inside. The faint clink of her diamond bracelet as she adjusted it betrayed her agitation. When Santiago arrived, her parents, Ignacio and Elena Lopez, were seated with her, their expressions stony. Santiago, Ignacio greeted him, his tone clipped. I hope you have a good explanation for what happened last night. Santiago nodded, his gaze steady. I do. But first, I need to speak with Isabela. Alone. Ignacio's lips tightened, but he rose from his chair, motioning for Elena to follow him out of the room. Once they were gone, Isabela fixed Santiago with a cold stare. Well, she demanded, what do you have to say for yourself? Santiago sat across from her, his posture composed but his voice filled with sincerity. Isabela, I never intended for things to happen this way. Last night, it wasn't planned. Wasn't planned? She snapped, her voice rising. You brought that woman here, Santiago. You invited her into our lives. And now, suddenly you have a son? How long have you known? I found out last night, he admitted. I didn't know about Diego until Maria told me. Isabella's laugh was bitter, her eyes flashing with anger. And now what? You think you can just step into his life and play the role of the doting father? What about us? What about our future? Santiago leaned forward, his voice firm but gentle. Isabela, I care about you. I care about everything we built. But Diego is my son. I can't ignore that. She shook her head. Disbelief etched across her face. So, what? You're going to abandon me for them? For a woman you haven't seen in years, and a child you didn't even know existed? It's not about abandoning anyone, Santiago said quietly. It's about doing what's right. Isabela stood abruptly, her hands clenched into fists. What's right? What's right is honoring the commitments you've made. To me, to my family. You think you can just walk away from this? Her words hung in the air, a challenge Santiago couldn't ignore. I'm not walking away, he said firmly, but I am going to be a part of Diego's life. That's non-negotiable. The tension in the room was suffocating as Isabela paced, her heels clicking sharply against the polished floor. Finally, she stopped, crossing her arms as she fixed Santiago with a steely gaze. Do you love her? She asked, her voice low but trembling with emotion. Santiago hesitated, the question cutting deeper than he had expected. It's not about love, Isabela. It's about responsibility. That's not an answer, she pressed, her eyes narrowing. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. I don't know how I feel about Maria, but I know how I feel about Diego, and he deserves to have his father in his life. Isabela's expression hardened. Then you've made your choice. When Santiago left the estate, he felt the weight of finality pressing down on him. The Lopez family partnership was as good as over, and with it, the future he had meticulously planned. But for all the uncertainty that lay ahead, Santiago felt a strange sense of clarity. His phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a text from Maria. Diego asked about you this morning. What should I tell him? A small smile tugged at Santiago's lips as he typed his response. Tell him I'll see him soon. Back in her apartment, Maria put her phone down, her heart conflicted. Last night had opened a door she wasn't sure she wanted to walk through. Santiago's intentions seemed genuine, but could she trust him to follow through? She glanced at Diego, who was sitting on the living room floor, engrossed in a puzzle. His green eyes sparkled with concentration, and his small hands moved deftly as he fit the pieces together. Mama, he said suddenly, looking up, will the man from last night come back? Maria knelt beside him, brushing a hand over his curls. Do you want him to? Diego thought for a moment, then nodded. He seemed nice, and he said he liked the garden lights. Her chest tightened, a mixture of hope and fear swirling within her. Maybe he will Carino. Maybe he will. Santiago stood outside the modest apartment building where Maria and Diego lived. The contrast between this unassuming neighborhood and the opulence of his own life was striking, but Santiago barely noticed. His focus was on the bouquet of sunflowers in his hand, their bright yellow petals a small gesture of goodwill for both mother and son. He took a deep breath, trying to calm the nervous energy coursing through him. The man who had once faced boardrooms full of corporate titans without flinching now felt uncharacteristically unsure. This wasn't a business deal. This was his son. Santiago finally rang the doorbell. Moments later, the door opened to reveal Maria, her expression guarded but not unkind. You're early, she said, stepping aside to let him in. I didn't want to waste a moment, Santiago replied, offering her the flowers. Maria accepted them with a small nod. Sunflowers. Diego will like these. Good, Santiago said, his voice softening. That's why I brought them. Inside, Diego was on the living room floor, his toy cars spread out in a careful arrangement that looked more like a miniature city. When he saw Santiago, his face lit up with excitement. The garden man! Diego exclaimed, scrambling to his feet. Santiago chuckled, crouching down at Diego's level. Guess I am the garden man, huh? Diego nodded enthusiastically, his green eyes sparkling. Do you like cars? I have a lot of them. I love cars, Santiago said, matching Diego's energy. Which one's your favorite? Diego immediately picked up a bright red race car, holding it out for Santiago to see. This one. It's super fast. It looks like it, Santiago replied, taking the car and examining it with mock seriousness. Do you think it can win a race? Maybe, Diego said with a giggle, but only if you help. Maria watched from the doorway, her arms crossed but her expression soft. She hadn't expected Diego to warm up to Santiago so quickly, and the sight of them playing together stirred a mix of emotions she wasn't prepared for. Diego, she called, breaking the moment. Why don't you show Santiago the puzzle you finished yesterday? Diego's eyes lit up. Okay. He ran to the coffee table and grabbed the completed puzzle, holding it up proudly. Santiago took it, examining the colorful picture of animals in a jungle. You did this all by yourself? Diego puffed out his chest. Yep. Mama helped a little, but I did most of it. That's amazing, Santiago said genuinely. You're really smart. Diego beamed, and Maria couldn't help but smile. After an hour of playing cars, building block towers, and listening to Diego's endless stories about school, Santiago felt a sense of joy he hadn't experienced in years. But as the clock ticked on, he realized it was time to address the elephant in the room. Diego, Santiago said gently, Can I ask you something? The boy nodded, his attention still focused on his blocks. Do you know who I am? Diego paused, his small hands hovering over a tower he was building. He looked up at Santiago, his head tilting slightly in thought. You're the garden man, he said simply. Santiago chuckled softly. Yes, I guess I am, but I'm also something else. Something important. Maria stepped closer, her heart pounding. I'm your dad, Santiago said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. Diego's eyes widened, and he looked to Maria for confirmation. She knelt beside him, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. It's true, Carino, she said softly. Santiago is your papa. Diego's gaze shifted between them, his young mind processing the information. After a long moment, he looked back at Santiago. Really? Really, Santiago said, his voice thick with emotion. I'm sorry I wasn't here before, but I'm here now, and I want to get to know you. Diego considered this, his small face serious. Then he smiled. Okay, but you have to play cards with me more. Santiago laughed, a sound that was equal parts relief and joy. Deal. Later, after Diego had gone to bed, Santiago and Maria sat in the small kitchen, a pot of tea between them. The silence was heavy but not uncomfortable. He took it better than I expected, Maria said finally, her voice quiet. Kids are resilient, Santiago replied, his gaze distant. He's incredible, Maria. You've done an amazing job raising him. Thank you, she said, a hint of pride in her voice. But this won't be easy, Santiago. Just because he's open to the idea now doesn't mean there won't be challenges later. I know, he said, meeting her gaze, but I'm ready for them. Whatever it takes. Maria studied him, searching for any sign of doubt. She found none. We'll see, she said, her tone measured. For now, let's take it one step at a time. Santiago nodded, understanding the significance of her words. It wasn't a promise, but it was a beginning. As he left the apartment that night, Santiago felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. For the first time, he wasn't thinking about deals, investments, or appearances. He was thinking about Diego. And for Santiago, that made all the difference. The days that followed marked a tentative shift in the lives of Santiago, Maria, and Diego. Santiago, once accustomed to boardrooms and power lunches, now found himself learning the rhythms of a 6-year-old's world. A world filled with early morning cartoons, endless questions, and a fascination with toy cars. Every evening after work, Santiago made his way to Maria's apartment, a small but significant gesture that did not go unnoticed. Diego's excitement at seeing him grew with each visit, and Santiago couldn't help but marvel at the bond they were forming. One evening, Santiago arrived with a soccer ball tucked under his arm. "What's that for?" Diego asked, his eyes lighting up. "For us," Santiago said, holding it out. "I thought we could go to the park and kick it around. What do you think?" Diego grabbed the ball eagerly. "Let's go." Maria, who had been watching from the kitchen, hesitated. She wasn't sure how she felt about Santiago stepping so seamlessly into their lives. But when she saw Diego's joy, she pushed her doubts aside. "I'll come with you," she said, grabbing her jacket. The park was quiet, the golden light of the setting sun casting long shadows over the grass. Santiago and Diego ran back and forth, their laughter echoing in the open space. Maria sat on a nearby bench, watching them with a mix of apprehension and warmth. Santiago wasn't perfect. She still didn't fully trust him, but he was trying. And for now, that was enough. At one point, Diego ran over to her, his cheeks flushed and his eyes sparkling. "Mama, come play with us." She laughed, shaking her head. "I think I'll leave the running to you too." Diego pouted, but Santiago came up behind him, resting a hand on his shoulder. "Let's let Mama take a break. You're wearing us both out." Diego giggled and ran back to the field, leaving Santiago and Maria alone for a moment. "He's incredible," Santiago said, his voice quiet but filled with emotion. Maria nodded. "He is. And he deserves stability, Santiago. That's all I want for him." "I know," he said, meeting her gaze. "And I'm committed to giving him that, to giving you both that." Maria looked away, her thoughts swirling. She wanted to believe him, but the scars of the past were hard to ignore. Later, as they walked back to the apartment, Diego held Santiago's hand, chattering about a school project involving dinosaurs. Santiago listened intently, nodding and asking questions. When they reached the apartment, Diego ran inside to show Maria the drawing he had made at school. Santiago lingered at the door, his expression thoughtful. "Thank you for letting me be part of his life," he said softly. Maria nodded, her voice steady. "You're doing well so far, but it's only the beginning." "I know," Santiago replied, "and I'm ready for the long haul." Over the next few weeks, a new routine developed. Santiago picked Diego up from school on Wednesdays, helped with his homework, and even started attending his soccer practices on weekends. At first, the other parents at the practices eyed him with curiosity, his tailored suits and luxury car making him stand out. But as Santiago traded his polished shoes for sneakers and joined in on drills with the kids, their curiosity turned to admiration. Diego beamed with pride every time Santiago showed up, and his excitement was infectious. Even Maria began to relax, allowing herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, Santiago was serious about this new chapter in their lives. One Saturday after practice, Santiago and Diego sat on the grass, sharing a bag of churros Santiago had brought. "Papa," Diego said suddenly, the word still new on his tongue. Santiago's heart swelled at the sound. "Yes, Diego. Will you come to my school play next week? Mama said I get to be a tree." Santiago chuckled. "A tree, huh? That sounds important." "Of course. I'll be there." Diego grinned, his face lighting up with joy. Maria, who had been watching from a distance, felt a pang of emotion. Seeing Diego so happy brought her a sense of peace, but it also reminded her of how precarious their situation still was. That night, after Diego had gone to bed, Maria and Santiago sat in the living room, the quiet hum of the city filling the space between them. "He's really taken to you," Maria said, breaking the silence. Santiago smiled faintly. "I feel like I've missed so much already. I'm trying to make up for lost time." Maria studied him, her expression unreadable. "Just remember, Santiago, This isn't just about Diego. If you leave again, it'll break his heart. And I won't let that happen. I won't leave, he said firmly. I've made mistakes, Maria, but this isn't one of them. I'm here to stay. For the first time, Maria allowed herself to hope that he might be telling the truth. The following week, Santiago arrived at Diego's school play just as parents and children were filing into the auditorium. The chatter of excited families filled the air, and colorful decorations adorned the walls, each hand-drawn by the students. Santiago held a small bouquet of daisies, Diego's favorite flower, according to Maria. Maria was already there, seated toward the middle of the auditorium. When she saw Santiago, she gave a small nod, her lips curling into a polite smile. He took the seat beside her, his nerves hidden beneath a calm exterior. "Did I miss anything?" Santiago asked quietly. Maria shook her head. "You're just in time. Diego's class is performing second." He exhaled in relief, glancing around the crowded room. Parents chatted and snapped photos, their excitement contagious. "Diego's been talking about this all week," Maria said, her tone soft. "He's proud you're here." Santiago's chest tightened at her words. "I wouldn't miss it for the world." When Diego's class took the stage, Santiago couldn't help but smile. The children, dressed as various woodland creatures and trees, stood in two uneven lines, each beaming with pride. Diego, in his tree costume, waved energetically when he spotted his parents in the audience. Maria chuckled, waving back. He's impossible to miss. As the play unfolded, Santiago found himself completely captivated, not by the amateur performance, but by the sight of his son. Diego delivered his single line with gusto, his voice ringing clear and confident through the room. The audience erupted into applause at the end, and Santiago's hands were the loudest to clap. Diego's face lit up with joy as he bowed with his classmates, the pride in his eyes unmistakable. After the play, families gathered in the school's courtyard to congratulate the young performers. Santiago and Maria stood off to the side as Diego ran toward them, his costume slightly askew but his grin unwavering. "Did you see me?" Diego asked breathlessly. "We did," Maria said, kneeling to fix his costume. "You were wonderful, Carino." Santiago handed Diego the bouquet of daisies, his voice warm. "These are for you. I'm so proud of you." Diego's eyes widened in delight as he took the flowers. "For me? Thanks, Papa." The word Papa still caught Santiago off guard, but it filled him with a sense of fulfillment he couldn't explain. As the crowd began to thin, one of Diego's teachers approached with a friendly smile. "Señor García," she said, addressing Santiago, "it's so nice to finally meet you. Diego talks about you all the time." Santiago glanced at Maria, who gave him an encouraging nod. "Thank you," he replied. "I'm glad I could be here today." The teacher turned to Maria. "Diego mentioned his father might be coming to our family day next month. We'd love to see you both there. It's a chance for parents to join in activities with the kids." Maria hesitated, glancing at Santiago. "I wasn't sure we'd attend, but—" Santiago stepped in, his voice steady. "We'll be there." Diego clapped his hands. "Yes, Papa, you can see my classroom." Maria gave Santiago a measured look, her expression unreadable. "We'll talk about it," she said finally. That evening, as Santiago walked Maria and Diego home, the excitement of the day began to settle. Diego skipped ahead, clutching his bouquet tightly, while Santiago and Maria followed at a slower pace. "Thank you for coming," Maria said, breaking the silence. Santiago looked at her, his expression earnest. "It meant a lot to me. And to Diego, I think." "It did," she admitted. "He's happy, Santiago. That's all I've ever wanted for him. And I want to keep him happy," Santiago said. "I know I can't erase the past, but I can try to make up for it." Maria nodded, her heart torn between hope and caution. Family Day is a big deal for the kids. If we go, it'll mean something to him. Don't promise things you can't keep. I won't, Santiago assured her. I'll be there. Later that night, as Santiago returned to his penthouse, he replayed the day in his mind. The pride on Diego's face, the warmth in Maria's voice. It all felt like pieces of a life he had never imagined for himself. For the first time in years, Santiago felt like he was building something real. The morning of Family Day arrived with bright sunshine streaming through the windows of Maria's apartment. Diego was already dressed, his excitement palpable as he zipped around the living room, clutching a handmade name tag that read Santiago García Ortega. "Mama, when is Papa coming?" Diego asked, bouncing on his toes. "He'll be here soon," Maria said, tying her hair into a loose braid. As if on cue, the doorbell rang. Diego bolted to the door, flinging it open to reveal Santiago standing there, holding a bag of snacks and a thermos of coffee. "Papa!" Diego exclaimed, throwing his arms around Santiago's waist. Santiago knelt to hug him, his smile wide. "You ready for today, champ?" "Yes. Mama says there's going to be games and prizes." Santiago chuckled. "Then we'll have to win a few, won't we?" Maria appeared in the doorway, her expression a mixture of amusement and warmth. "Good morning, Santiago." "Good morning," he replied, straightening up. "I brought coffee. I figured we could all use some energy for whatever Diego has planned." Maria raised an eyebrow but accepted the thermos. "You're learning?" The school's courtyard was alive with activity. Children darted between brightly colored tents and game stations, while parents mingled and participated in the events. The air was filled with laughter, the scent of freshly popped popcorn wafting through the breeze. Diego led Santiago and Maria toward his classroom, proudly showing them his drawings and crafts displayed on the walls. "This one's my favorite," Diego said, pointing to a picture of a tree covered in animals. "It's wonderful," Santiago said, crouching to examine it more closely. "You're really talented, Diego." Maria smiled softly. "He spends hours drawing. It's his favorite thing to do." Diego beamed at the praise, his chest puffing out. "Maybe I'll be an artist someday." "Or anything else you want to be," Santiago said, ruffling his hair. As the day went on, Santiago found himself pulled into every activity Diego wanted to try. Together, they tossed bean bags, ran three-legged races, and even competed in a trivia contest about dinosaurs, a topic Diego dominated with ease. Maria watched from the sidelines, her heart swelling as she saw Santiago fully immersed in Diego's world. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe that he might truly be here to stay. During a break, the three of them sat under a shady tree, sharing a bag of chips. Diego sprawled on the grass, munching happily, while Maria and Santiago sat side by side on a blanket. "He's having the time of his life," Maria said, her voice soft. Santiago nodded, his gaze fixed on Diego. "So am I." Maria glanced at him, her defenses wavering. "You're doing well, Santiago. I didn't expect you to adjust so quickly." "I didn't know what I was missing," he admitted, his voice tinged with regret. "But now that I do, I don't want to miss another moment." Maria looked away, her emotions threatening to overwhelm her. "It's not just about showing up for the good times. There will be hard days, too. Days when Diego's upset or confused. Are you ready for that?" "I am," Santiago said without hesitation. "Whatever it takes." The final event of the day was a family relay race, and Diego insisted on participating with both his parents. "Are you sure you want me in this?" Maria teased. "I'm not exactly athletic." "You'll be great," Diego said, tugging her toward the starting line. "Papa can help you if you get tired." Santiago grinned. Team effort, right? The race was chaotic, but filled with laughter. Diego ran with uncontainable energy, while Maria and Santiago tried to keep up, passing batons and navigating obstacles with varying degrees of success. When they crossed the finish line together, Diego threw his arms in the air, declaring them the winners regardless of their actual placement. That was awesome, Diego said, collapsing onto the grass with a wide grin. Maria laughed, sitting beside him. You're a champion, Diego, and you're my team, Diego said, pulling both of them into a hug. For a moment, the world seemed to pause, the three of them caught in a perfect bubble of happiness. As they walked home that evening, Diego holding both of their hands, Maria couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. Santiago had stepped into Diego's life with genuine effort and care, and it was clear that Diego adored him. But as they reached the apartment building, reality crept back in. Maria knew that building a family wasn't as simple as sharing a happy day at the park or school. Trust took time, and Santiago still had much to prove. When they reached the door, Santiago knelt to Diego's level. I had a great time today, buddy. Thank you for letting me be part of it. Diego hugged him tightly. Me too, Papa. Can we do it again soon? Absolutely, Santiago promised. Maria watched the exchange, her emotions swirling. As much as she wanted to protect herself and Diego from future disappointment, she couldn't deny the bond forming between them. Thank you for coming, she said quietly as Santiago stood. He looked at her, his expression earnest. Thank you for letting me. That night, after Diego was asleep, Maria stood at the window, looking out at the city lights. Her heart felt lighter than it had in years, but her mind was restless. Could Santiago truly be the father Diego needed? Could he be the partner she had once dreamed of? As the city buzzed below, Maria resolved to take it one day at a time. For now, that was all she could do. The weeks after Family Day passed in a blur of routines and shared moments. Santiago continued to show up, not just for Diego but for Maria as well. He drove Diego to soccer practice, helped with school projects, and even joined Maria in the kitchen on occasion, laughing as he fumbled his way through recipes. To an outsider, they might have seemed like a family, but Maria's walls remained firmly in place. She couldn't deny the joy Santiago brought to Diego's life, but her trust was harder to rebuild. One evening, after Diego had gone to bed, Santiago and Maria sat in the living room, the hum of the city filtering through the open window. You've been quiet tonight, Santiago said, breaking the silence. Maria sipped her tea, her gaze distant. Just thinking. About what? She hesitated, then set her cup down. About you. About us. Santiago leaned forward, his expression earnest. Maria, if there's something you need to say, just say it. She took a deep breath, her voice steady but tinged with vulnerability. You've been doing everything right, Santiago. Diego loves having you around, and I can see how much effort you're putting in. But I keep wondering, how long will it last? His brow furrowed. What do you mean? I mean this isn't a sprint, she said. It's a lifetime commitment. And as much as I want to believe you're here to stay, a part of me is still waiting for you to walk away again. Her words hit him like a punch to the gut. He stood, running a hand through his hair as he tried to find the right response. I get it, he said finally. I've given you every reason to doubt me. But, Maria, I'm not the same man I was 6 years ago. I've learned what matters, and it's not the money or the success. It's this. It's you and Diego. She looked at him, her heart aching with conflicting emotions. I want to believe you, Santiago, but it's not just about me anymore. It's about him. If you leave again, it won't just hurt me. It'll hurt him too. Santiago's jaw tightened, his voice steady but filled with determination. I won't leave. I can't promise I won't make mistakes, but I'll never abandon Diego. Or you. Maria's eyes glistened, but she quickly blinked back the tears. Actions speak louder than words, Santiago. Time will tell if you mean what you say. The next morning, Santiago arrived at his office feeling unusually unsettled. The tension from the night before lingered, and for the first time in years, his work felt secondary. As he stepped into the sleek, glass-walled boardroom for a meeting, his assistant Alejandro handed him a folder. The Lopez family sent over the revised partnership terms, Alejandro said. Santiago froze, his mind flashing back to the fallout with Isabela. He hadn't spoken to her since the wedding, and he had assumed the partnership was dead in the water. "What terms?" Santiago asked, his tone sharp. "They're offering to continue the deal," Alejandro explained, lowering his voice. "But there's a condition." Santiago opened the folder, his jaw tightening as he read the document. The condition was clear: full public reconciliation with Isabela. "They want me to patch things up with her," he muttered, more to himself than to Alejandro. "Yes," Alejandro said carefully. "It seems they're willing to overlook what happened at the wedding, as long as you and Isabela present a united front." Santiago closed the folder, his stomach churning. The partnership was lucrative, one of the biggest deals of his career. But accepting the terms would mean compromising the life he was trying to build with Maria and Diego. That evening, Santiago found himself at Maria's apartment, his thoughts weighed down by the day's revelations. Diego greeted him at the door with a wide grin. "Papa, we're making cookies." Santiago forced a smile, ruffling Diego's hair. "Sounds like fun. Can I join?" Diego nodded eagerly, dragging him into the kitchen where Maria stood at the counter, a bowl of dough in front of her. "You're just in time," she said, handing him an apron. As they worked together, the heaviness in Santiago's chest began to lift. The simplicity of the moment, mixing dough, laughing at Diego's attempts to sneak chocolate chips, reminded him of what he stood to lose. When the cookies were in the oven and Diego had wandered off to play, Maria leaned against the counter, watching Santiago. "You seem distracted," she said. "Is everything okay?" Santiago hesitated, then nodded. "Just work. Nothing important." Maria gave him a knowing look but didn't press further. That night, after Diego was asleep, Santiago stood by the window, staring out at the city lights. Maria joined him, her expression soft but curious. "Is it really nothing?" she asked. Santiago sighed, his shoulders sagging. "It's the Lopez partnership. They're willing to move forward, but only if I reconcile with Isabela." Maria's stomach sank, but she kept her voice steady. "And what are you going to do?" He turned to her, his gaze unwavering. "I'm going to turn it down, because it's not worth losing this. Losing you and Diego." Maria's breath caught, her emotions threatening to overwhelm her. For the first time, she saw not just words, but a choice, a deliberate decision to prioritize them. "Santiago," she began, but he shook his head. "I mean it, Maria," he said. "This is where I want to be. And no deal, no amount of money, is worth walking away from that." Maria searched his face, and for the first time, she let herself believe that he was telling the truth. "Maybe," she said softly, "we can figure this out together." Santiago smiled, the weight on his chest lifting. "I like that." The Lopez partnership was officially dissolved the following week. Santiago walked out of the negotiation room with a weight lifted from his shoulders. For the first time in his career, he had chosen something other than success, and though the decision had cost him a significant deal, he felt a deep sense of peace. Later that evening, Santiago found himself at Maria's apartment, holding a small wrapped package. He hadn't told her about the deal's collapse yet. He wanted her to hear it from him directly. Diego was the first to spot him through the window and ran to the door, throwing it open with an excited shout. "Papa S. here." Santiago knelt to greet him, ruffling his hair. "Hey, buddy. How was school today?" Diego launched into an animated story about a science project involving papier-mâché volcanoes, his hands waving as he described the eruption. Santiago listened intently, laughing at his son's enthusiasm. Maria appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "Come in, Santiago," she said, her tone warm but curious. After dinner, while Diego was in his room playing, Santiago finally turned to Maria. "There's something I need to tell you." Her brow furrowed, and she set down the mug of tea she had been holding. "What is it?" He took a deep breath. "The Lopez partnership is over. I walked away from the deal." Maria's eyes widened and she leaned forward. Why, that partnership was important to you. It was, Santiago admitted, but their terms weren't. They wanted me to reconcile with Isabela, to pretend nothing had happened at the wedding. I couldn't do that. I couldn't compromise what I've been building with you and Diego. Maria stared at him, her emotions swirling. That's the big decision. Santiago reached for her hand, his voice steady. It was the right decision. You and Diego are more important to me than any deal, no matter how lucrative. I don't just want to be part of his life. I want to build a life with both of you. Her breath caught, and for a moment, she didn't know how to respond. The sincerity in Santiago's eyes was undeniable, and the weight of his words settled over her like a warm embrace. You mean that? She asked softly. Every word, he said. In the weeks that followed, Santiago continued to prove his commitment. He didn't just show up for Diego. He showed up for Maria, too. He helped with grocery shopping, joined them for quiet family dinners, and even took Diego to the zoo on a rainy Saturday. Coming home soaked but laughing, their relationship deepened slowly, each moment building on the last. Maria found herself lowering her guard, allowing Santiago into parts of her life she had kept closed off for so long. One evening, as they sat on the couch watching a movie, Diego curled up between them. Santiago reached over and took Maria's hand. She didn't pull away. Spring arrived with its promise of renewal, and Santiago decided it was time for a new step. On a sunny afternoon, he brought Maria and Diego to the park where they had first played soccer together. As Diego chased a kite, Santiago turned to Maria, his expression both nervous and hopeful. There's something I want to ask you, he said, pulling a small velvet box from his pocket. Maria's eyes widened as he opened it, revealing a simple but elegant ring. María Ortega, Santiago said, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. I spent years chasing the wrong dreams, but now I know what I truly want, to build a life with you and Diego. Will you marry me? Tears filled Maria's eyes, and for a moment, she couldn't speak. She glanced at Diego, who was running toward them, his kite trailing behind him. When he reached them, he looked up, curious. Mama, why are you crying? Maria knelt, pulling Diego close. Because I'm happy, Carino. She looked at Santiago, her heart full. Yes, Santiago. I'll marry you. Diego's face lit up. Does that mean we're all a family now? Maria smiled, kissing his forehead. Yes, Carino. We're a family. As they embraced, the wind carried the sound of Diego's laughter through the park. The path to this moment had been anything but easy, but Santiago knew it was worth every step. For the first time in his life, he felt truly at home. Thank you for joining us on this journey through love, ambition, and redemption. Stories like these remind us of the power of choices and the importance of family. Santiago's path was far from straightforward, but it is proof that it's never too late to prioritize what truly matters. We appreciate your patience and understanding as this narrative unfolded. If there were any moments of inconsistency or errors in the storytelling, we sincerely apologize. Your feedback is invaluable, and we welcome your thoughts on how to continue improving. Please feel free to share your opinions, as they inspire us to create even better stories. Stay tuned for more heartfelt tales that resonate and entertain. Thank you for being a part of this journey.